Welcome to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. Let's see. The story we have today comes from England. This is a story called Little Johnny Buttermilk. Once, long ago, in a country under a blue sky in a green country, there lived a little boy named Johnny. He lived in a red house with his mother and his father. Well, one day, Johnny was watching his father as he was feeding the hogs, and he said, "Father, can I help you?" And his father said, "No, Johnny, not today. You're a little too young still. Maybe when you're older." Johnny didn't like that answer. So then he went to his mother, and he watched his mother as she was making the butter. And he said, "Mother, can I help you?" And she said, "Well, Johnny, you know, we have to take these pails of buttermilk to the market in the town nearby and sell them. And it's a long walk, and your legs are young. So if you think you could do that, that would be a big help." And he said, "All right, Mother, I'll take them." And he picked up the 2 pails of buttermilk, and he took them into the town, and he sold them at the market. And when he came home at night, his pockets were jingling with money. Well, Johnny kept doing that. Every morning he would take the buttermilk, and he would go into town, and he would sell the buttermilk in the market. And then at night he would come home with his pockets jingling with the money that his family needed to buy their food. After a little while, everybody in town got to know Johnny, and they started to call him Little Johnny Buttermilk. Well, one day, Johnny was walking into town, and do you know, living somewhere near them, there was an old witch, and she was pretty crotchety. And one day, as Johnny was walking into town, the witch jumped out in front of him, and she said, "Give me that buttermilk." And he said, "No." Johnny said, "I have to take this into town and sell it and bring back the money so my family has money to buy our food." And the witch said, "If you won't give me that buttermilk, then I'll take it, and you too." And she grabbed Johnny, and she popped him and the sacks of buttermilk into a big sack, and she slung it over her shoulder, and she started to walk home. But as she was walking home, all of a sudden she remembered, "I can't use this buttermilk. I bought a pot in town, and I forgot to pick it up from the shop. I need to go back and get it so I can cook the buttermilk and make my pie and make my soup and stuff with it." And so she took that heavy sack off her shoulder, and there was 2 men who were just there, and they were trimming the hedge and making it all pretty. And she said, "Could you watch my sack for me for a few minutes? I need to run back into town and pick up the pot that I forgot." And they said, "Yes, ma'am, of course, we'll be here for a while, not a problem." And so the witch left the sack there, and she ran back to town to get the pot. Well, as soon as she was gone, Johnny Buttermilk called out from the sack, "Help me, let me out. She wants to eat me." Well, the men were very surprised to hear a voice of a kid coming from that sack. And so they came running over, and they untied the sack, and out popped Johnny Buttermilk with his 2 pails of buttermilk. And he said, "She was going to eat me. Thank you very, very much. Do you think maybe we could fill the sack with maybe some of the thistles and the thorns that you've been cleaning up from around by the hedge?" And the men said, "Yes, that would be a grand plan." And so they filled that sack up as full as they could with the thistles and the thorns that were left over from cleaning up the hedge. And they tied it up, and Johnny Buttermilk took a different road, and he went into town. And by the time the witch came back with her pot, he was in town with his pails selling the buttermilk. Well, the witch, she picked up that sack, and she slung it on her back, and she started to walk home. And every time she took a step, those thistles and those thorns poked her in the back. And as she walked, she thought, "My goodness, this boy has become very bristly." when she got home, she swung the sack off her shoulder and she opened it up, and thistles and thorns fell out. No buttermilk and no boy. Well, she was quite angry, but there was nothing she could do about it now, because by that time, Johnny had already sold all the buttermilk and he was back home with his mama and his papa, with his pockets bristling with money. Well, the next day, Johnny decided that he was going to avoid the witch this time. He went early to town. But the witch was wise to that plan, and she was waiting for him already. And she jumped out, and she grabbed him by the arm, and she said, "Give me that buttermilk." And he said, "No, I have to sell the buttermilk in town so we can have money to buy food." And she said, "Well, then I'll take it, and you too, and I'll boil you in it." And she popped Johnny and the buttermilk into a sack. She put the sack on her back, and she started to walk home. But all of a sudden, as she was walking, she remembered that even when she got home, she wasn't going to have anything to eat her food on because she just bought a new set of plates in town and she left them at the shop. And so she looked around and she saw some men just there, and they were fixing holes in the road. And so she put the sack down and she said, "Could you watch my sack for me for a few moments? I forgot to pick up my plates in town and I've got to go back and get them." And they said, "Oh, yes, ma'am. We'll watch the sack for you. Don't worry. It won't go anywhere." Well, as soon as the witch had gone back into town to pick up her plates, Johnny Buttermilk called out from the sack, help me, let me out. She wants to boil me." Well, the men were very surprised to hear a kid's voice coming from the sack, and so they went running over and they untied it, and out popped Johnny Buttermilk with his 2 pails of buttermilk. And he said, "Thank you so much. She was going to boil me in my buttermilk. Do you think maybe we could put some of those big rocks that you're taking out of the road and we could put them in the sack?" And they said, "That's a grand plan." And so they took the big rocks that they were taking out of the road and they put them in the sack and they tied the sack up, and Johnny took a different road into town. And by the time the witch got back with her plates, Johnny was already in town selling his buttermilk in the market. Well, the witch got back and she picked up that sack and she swung it on her back. And oh, with every step, those rocks and stones hit her in the back. So by the time she got home, she was all black and blue. She got to the house and she swung the sack down and she, "Oh, this boy has gotten very fat and heavy." She untied the sack, and you know, those stones, they fell out, almost landed on her feet. She was so angry, she almost burst. But there was nothing she could do about it, because by that time, little Johnny Buttermilk had finished selling all the buttermilk, and he was already back home with his mama and his papa, with his pockets jingling with coins. Well, the next morning, Johnny decided he was going to have to do something really smart to get away from that witch. So he waited, and he didn't go into town right away in the morning. He went late. He thought maybe the witch would have gotten tired of waiting for him by then. But witches have a lot of patience. So as Johnny was walking through the woods, all of a sudden the witch jumped out and grabbed him by the arm. She said, "Give me that buttermilk." And he said, "No, I have to sell it in town so we have money for food." And the witch said, "Well, then I'll take it, and you too, and I'm going to stew you for my supper." And she popped Johnny and the pails of buttermilk into a sack, and she put it over her shoulder. And as she was walking home, suddenly she remembered she had bought a hammer in the shop in town, and she had forgotten to pick it up. Well, this time, she didn't want Johnny to get away. So she took that sack all the way home, and she put it down on the floor in her kitchen, and she walked out, and she locked the door, and she said, "This time, you won't get away from me, you little boy." And she went back to town for her hammer. Now, I don't know how many of you know little boys, but every little boy I know has all kinds of things in his pocket. And it just so happens that Johnny was one of those kinds of little boys. and he had a knife in his pocket. And he remembered that he had that knife in his pocket. And so he reached around into his pocket and he brought out his knife and he cut a hole in the sack so he could climb out and pull out his pails of buttermilk. Well, then he looked around the witch's house and he saw her best china dishes. And he took them all off the shelf and he put them in the sack. And then he saw the witch's sewing kit, and he went over and he picked up a needle and thread, and his mother had taught him to sew so that he could fix the tears that he kept putting in his own breeches. And he sewed up that hole in the sack, and he turned it so that the witch wouldn't see that it had been cut open and sewed shut. And then Johnny climbed up the chimney, and he popped out the top with his pails of buttermilk, and he slid down off the roof, and he ran into town by a different road. And by the time the witch got back to her house, Johnny was in town selling all of his buttermilk in the marketplace. Well, the witch, she thought she really had that boy trapped this time. And so she went to her house and she took out the hammer. She had it in her hand and she unlocked the door and she ran into the kitchen and she smash onto that sack with her hammer. That's done for you, you naughty little boy. And then she opened up the sack. And all that came out was not buttermilk and boy. It was bits and pieces of her smashed up best china. And this time, the witch was so angry that she really did burst. And that was the end of her. And little Johnny Buttermilk went home from the market with his pockets jingling with coins, and he and his mama and his papa lived very happy, very long lives in their red house in the green country under the blue sky. And that is the story of little Johnny Buttermilk from England. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again on Friday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page. Bye.